ATC asks you to descend before the FMC calculated top of descent point. Reset the MCP altitude. Show the descent page. A path descent is planned. Push the line select key adjacent to Descend Now. Execute the modification. The FMC commands a 1,000 feet per minute descent until you come to the VNAV descent path. Then the FMC commands idle thrust and pitch to follow the path. Next, let's do an early descent using VNAV speed. I reset the MCP. Before you do the early descent, change to a speed descent. Start the early descent. Execute the modification. The FMC commands an idle thrust descent at the target airspeed. The FMC does not try to go to the VNAV path. If you put in accurate descent forecast data, the vertical deviation is usually near zero and the airspeed is near the target. The wind can be different than the forecast wind you put in the FMC. In this example, the tailwind is more than the wind you put in the FMC. During a path descent, the FMC commands pitch to keep the path, but the airspeed will be higher than the target. You can use the speed brake to add drag and decrease airspeed to the target. If you let speed increase to 10 knots or more than the target, the FMC shows the scratchpad message, drag required. You are below the airport speed restriction altitude. If you do not use the speed brake when the drag required message shows, VNAV disconnects when the airspeed is more than 5 knots above the airport speed restriction. The FMC shows the scratchpad message, overspeed disconnect. Let's look at the same conditions for a VNAV speed descent. During a VNAV speed descent, the FMC commands pitch to keep the target airspeed. The tailwind moves the airplane above the VNAV path. Use the speed brake if you want to go back to the VNAV path. In this example, you are near a waypoint with an altitude constraint during a VNAV speed descent. If you let the airplane go above the VNAV path, the FMC shows the scratchpad message, Unable Next Altitude. You cannot make the altitude constraint at this rate of descent. In the next example, the headwind is more than the wind you put in the FMC. During a path descent, the FMC commands pitch to keep the path, but the airspeed will be lower than the target. You can use the thrust to increase airspeed to the target. If airspeed decreases to 10 knots or more below the target, the FMC commands more thrust to increase airspeed to the target. During a VNAV speed descent, the FMC commands pitch to keep the target airspeed. The headwind moves the airplane below the VNAV path. Use thrust if you want to go back to the VNAV path. The FMC calculates a new descent path and top of descent when you do a modification. Put in all known descent and approach data before you start descent. For example, if you change the target speed on the descent page, the FMC calculates a new VNAV path. A slower descent speed moves the top of descent closer to you. You are on the path. Put in the new descent speed. Enter this data into the correct line. The FMC calculates a modified path. Execute them. When you execute, the vertical deviation changes suddenly. You are on the path again. Resume normal speed by selecting the Econ prompt. The path changes again. The waypoint restriction line shows the next waypoint with an altitude constraint. You can delete an altitude constraint here or on the legs page. Use the descent page to delete the constraint at Dene. The FMC calculates a new path. VNAV path and VNAV speed descents do path corrections very differently. If you are below the path in a path descent, the FMC commands less pitch to decrease the descent rate. The FMC commands more thrust to keep the target speed. You are above the path in a path descent. The FMC pitches down to get back to the path. And the airspeed increases. When this occurs, the airspeed can go to VMO. Use the speed brake to decrease airspeed. In a speed descent, the FMC does not try to stay on the path. If you want, use the speed brake or thrust to stay on the path. But if you are below the path and there is a waypoint with an altitude constraint, The FMC commands level flight at the constraint altitude. The descent continues after you pass the waypoint. You are not at top of descent. Start a VNAV path descent now. The tailwind is more than forecast. Do the applicable procedure. Use VNAV to change the descent speed. The scratch pad is incorrect. Use the descent page to delete the altitude constraint at Ephrata. Show the descent forecast page. Put in the ISA deviation and QNH. Put the descent wind on the first wind line. Complete the change. Set the FMC for a VNAV speed descent. Use the speed point. Reset the MCP for descent. Correct to the VNAV path.